There are structures on this planet that have no logical explanation. Blocks of stone that weigh more than 200 tons, placed with a precision that leaves no room for error. Walls that have stood for thousands of years without a single crack. Chambers buried deep underground that no one can fully explain. For a long time, the official answer was simple: humans built them. But that answer has never been enough. Because when the real numbers are examined, the weight, the height, the alignment, the sheer scale, one question keeps coming back. How did they do it? The answer that has been buried for centuries points to something far beyond ordinary human hands. It points to the NEPHILIM, beings of enormous size and strength who walked this earth long before the pyramids existed, and whose existence was used by the most powerful rulers in ancient history to accomplish something no army of ordinary men could ever achieve. Before we reveal what happened, share this video, leave your like, and subscribe to this channel. What you are about to see changes everything. The story begins long before the first stone was ever placed in the desert. The NEPHILIM were already here. They had been on the earth for a long time. Their size was unlike anything that existed among ordinary humans. Their physical strength was on a completely different level. They consumed enormous amounts of food. They required enormous amounts of space. And they moved through the world in a way that left a visible mark on everything around them. They were not hidden. They were known. The people who lived in the ancient world were aware of them. The rulers of those times were aware of them. And it was precisely because of this awareness that a plan began to take shape. A plan that would take generations to develop, and that would eventually result in the most massive construction project the world had ever seen. But to understand how the NEPHILIM were used to build the pyramids, it is necessary to understand the situation that existed before the construction began. The NEPHILIM had survived the Great Flood, not all of them, but enough. After the waters receded and the land became dry again, some of these beings were still present in the world. They moved through different regions. Some settled in the lands near the great river. Others moved into the hills and the highlands. They continued to reproduce, though in smaller numbers than before. And they continued to be seen by the human populations around them. For ordinary humans, encountering a NEPHILIM was not a normal experience. These were beings that stood at heights far beyond any man. Their bones were heavier, their muscles were built for carrying weight that would destroy a human body. They ate more in one day than a group of men could eat in a week. And they were difficult to control. Not impossible, but difficult. The early rulers in the region understood one thing very clearly. If the NEPHILIM could be directed, their power could be used. This was not a new idea. Throughout the period after the flood, there had been attempts to put the strength of the NEPHILIM to practical use. They had been used in conflicts, in clearing land, in moving large stones for smaller structures. But these were limited, temporary uses. No ruler had yet attempted to organize the NEPHILIM on a massive scale for a single, sustained, long-term project. That changed when the decision was made to build the pyramids. The decision did not come quickly. It came after a long period of planning, of observation, and of understanding exactly what would be needed. The rulers who made this decision had access to knowledge that most people around them did not have. They had records of what the NEPHILIM were capable of. They had accounts of the structures that had existed before the flood. Massive buildings, large walls, constructions that required power beyond human capacity. And they had a clear vision of what they wanted to create. They wanted something permanent, something that would last beyond any human lifespan, something that would be visible from a great distance, something that would signal to anyone who saw it that the power behind its creation was not ordinary. The pyramid shape was chosen for specific reasons. It was stable. It distributed weight evenly. It could be built in stages, with each level providing a platform for the next. And it could reach a height that no other type of structure at the time could achieve. But achieving that height, with those stones in that desert, required something no human workforce alone could provide. It required the NEPHILIM. The process of securing the NEPHILIM for the construction project was not simple. These beings did not willingly submit to direction. They had their own patterns of movement, their own behaviors, and their own ways of responding to authority. Convincing them, or forcing them, to participate in organized labor on a massive scale required a system. That system was built over time. The rulers used a combination of control methods. Food was one of the most powerful. The NEPHILIM required enormous quantities of food to sustain their bodies, and controlling the food supply gave the rulers leverage. Settlements were established near the construction sites where food was provided in exchange for labor. Over generations, some groups of NEPHILIM became accustomed to this arrangement. They stayed near the settlements, they responded to the routines that were established, and they became, over time, a workforce. Not willing in the way a human volunteer is willing, but present, fed, and directed. There were also NEPHILIM who were captured and held. This was dangerous work. Taking a NEPHILIM by force required large numbers of men, coordination, and the right conditions. But it was done. Younger NEPHILIM, those who had not yet reached their full size, were sometimes taken and raised in controlled conditions near the construction sites. By the time they were fully grown, they had lived their entire lives within the system and were easier to direct than those captured as adults. The combination of these methods, controlled food supply, settlement arrangements, and captive-raised individuals, created the workforce that would eventually move the stones. Before any stone could be moved, the site had to be prepared. The area chosen for the construction was on elevated ground near the great river. It was solid rock beneath the surface, which was important for supporting the weight of what would be built. The ground had to be leveled. The boundaries of the structure had to be marked. The pathways that the stones would travel had to be cleared and prepared. This preparation work was done largely by human laborers, the ordinary men and women who served the rulers of that time. There were thousands of them involved in the preparation phase. They dug, they cleared, they measured, they used tools made from copper and stone. They worked in organized teams with supervisors over each group. While the preparation was happening, the quarrying of stone was also beginning. The stone for the pyramids came from different locations. Some of it came from the cliffs directly beside the construction site. Other stone, the harder, more precisely cut stone used for the outer casing and the internal chambers, came from quarries located further away, requiring transportation across land and water. Cutting the stone was a task that required human skill and precision. The workers at the quarries used copper tools, stone hammers, and wooden wedges driven into natural cracks in the rock. They worked in teams, following lines that had been marked by more experienced workers. The cutting process was slow and required constant effort. But moving the cut stone was a different problem entirely. Some of the blocks used in the construction of the pyramids weighed over 50 tons. The heaviest stones, those used in the lower chambers and the base layers, weighed considerably more. Moving these blocks with human muscle alone, even with large numbers of men, ropes, and wooden sleds, was not feasible for the largest pieces. This was where the Nephilim became essential. The Nephilim were used primarily as carriers and movers of the largest stones. Their physical structure allowed them to lift and carry weights that would have required hundreds of ordinary men with equipment. The process was organized. Stones were cut and shaped by human workers at the quarries, then brought to staging areas where the Nephilim could access them. At the staging areas, the Nephilim would take the blocks. Some were carried directly. Others were moved using large wooden sleds that the Nephilim pulled. The paths from the quarries to the construction site had been prepared specifically for this movement. Compacted earth, wet to reduce friction, with wooden planks placed along the most difficult sections. The Nephilim moved in groups when handling the very largest stones. Multiple individuals working together could move a single block that even one of them could not manage alone. The supervisors, human overseers who worked with the Nephilim teams, learned over time how to direct these movements. They developed signals, routines, and patterns that the Nephilim came to recognize and respond to. The daily operation at the construction site was a combination of human precision and Nephilim power. Human workers handled the measuring, the fitting, and the fine work. They used copper tools to smooth surfaces, to create the tight fits between the blocks, and to shape the internal chambers. They worked in shifts, with teams rotating to maintain constant progress. Their numbers were large. Estimates based on the scale of the work suggest that tens of thousands of humans were involved in the construction at various points. The Nephilim handled the heavy transport and the placement of the largest blocks. Their involvement was concentrated in the phases of the construction that required raw physical power, moving stones from the quarries, carrying them to the site, and lifting them into position as the structure rose higher. As the pyramid grew taller, the process of placing the upper stones became more complex. In the lower levels, stones could be moved along the ground and slid into position with relatively straightforward methods. But as the structure rose above the ground level, a way had to be found to get the stones up to the level where they were being placed. Ramps were the solution. Large ramps of compacted earth and rubble were constructed alongside the pyramid as it rose. The ramps allowed stones to be moved upward along a gradual incline rather than lifted straight up. As the pyramid grew taller, the ramps were extended and adjusted. The Nephilim were used on the ramps as well. Pulling loaded sleds up a long incline required the same kind of sustained power as moving them across flat ground. And for the heaviest stones, Nephilim were the only ones capable of doing it without the construction halting. The internal structure of the pyramid was being built at the same time as the exterior. The internal chambers and passages were not added after the pyramid was complete. They were part of the construction from the beginning. As each layer of stone was placed, the spaces inside were being shaped. The chambers required the most precise stonework in the entire structure. The walls, floors, and ceilings of the main chambers were built with a level of accuracy that left almost no visible gaps between the stones. This precision was achieved by human craftsmen working with copper tools and measuring instruments. The Nephilim were not involved in this fine work. Their size and the nature of their physical capabilities made them unsuitable for it. The internal chambers were built by teams of skilled human workers who spent years developing the techniques required. The granite beams used to roof the main chambers were among the heaviest single pieces of stone in the entire structure. Some of these beams weighed more than 70 tons. Moving them from the quarry where they were cut, which was located hundreds of miles from the construction site, to their final position inside the pyramid required a sustained effort that lasted months for each beam. The transport of the granite beams from the distant quarry involved water as well as land. The stones were loaded onto large wooden boats on the Great River and carried downstream to a point near the construction site. Unloading them from the boats and moving them overland to the site required the full deployment of the Nephilim workforce. Once at the site, the granite beams had to be raised to the level of the chambers they would roof. This was one of the most demanding operations in the entire construction. The ramps that had been used for the outer stones were extended and reinforced specifically for moving these beams. The Nephilim worked in concentrated groups during these operations, with human supervisors directing every step of the movement. Getting a 70-ton granite beam into its final position required exact placement. There was no room for adjustment once the beam was in position. The surrounding stones locked it in place permanently. The coordination between the Nephilim doing the physical work and the human workers directing the placement had to be precise. As the construction progressed and the pyramid rose higher, the number of Nephilim required for the work decreased. The higher levels of the pyramid used smaller stones than the lower levels, and the total volume of material being placed at each level was smaller. The heavy transport work that had dominated the early phases gave way to more concentrated, careful placement work. But the Nephilim was still present. They continued to be used for moving stones up the ramps and for handling the heavier pieces at each level. Their involvement continued through all phases of the exterior construction. The outer casing of the pyramid was the final layer of the exterior. These casing stones were made of a finer, whiter limestone than the core stones. They were cut with great precision and fitted together to create a smooth, angled surface on the outside of the structure. The casing stones were not the heaviest pieces used in the construction, but they had to be placed with great accuracy to achieve the smooth exterior surface. The work on the casing stones was primarily done by human craftsmen. The stones were shaped to precise angles, moved into position, and fitted together. The outer surface of the completed pyramid was almost entirely smooth, a continuous angled face of white stone that reflected the sun and could be seen from a great distance across the flat desert. By the time the casing was complete, the construction of the exterior was finished. What remained was the finishing work on the internal spaces and the sealing of the passages and chambers. The passages inside the pyramid were narrow, deliberately so. The narrowness of the passages served multiple purposes. It made the internal spaces more structurally stable. It limited access to the chambers at the center of the structure, and it meant that the passages could only be used by people of ordinary human size. The Nephilim could not enter the internal passages of the completed pyramid. Their size prevented it. This was not an accident. The internal structure of the pyramid was designed and built by the human workers who also used it, and its dimensions were matched to human proportions. The NEPHILIM had built the shell. The humans had built what was inside. When the construction was complete, the pyramid stood at a height of nearly 140 meters. Its base covered an area of more than 5 hectares. The total weight of the stone used in its construction was approximately 6 million tons. It was the largest structure that had ever been built on the surface of the earth up to that point. Nothing like it had ever existed before. The process of completing the pyramid took decades. The initial preparation of the site, the quarrying of stone, the construction of the lower levels, the building of the internal chambers, the raising of the upper levels, and the placement of the outer casing. All of this required sustained effort over a very long period. Multiple generations of human workers were involved. The NEPHILIM workforce also changed over this period as older individuals were replaced by younger ones raised in the controlled conditions near the site. The organization required to maintain this operation over so many years was itself a remarkable achievement. The rulers who oversaw the construction had to keep the food supply for the NEPHILIM stable, keep the human workforce fed and organized, manage the logistics of quarrying and transporting stone from multiple locations, and maintain the safety of the operation in conditions that were often dangerous. Accidents happened. Moving multi-ton blocks of stone using any method carries risk, and over the decades of construction, workers were killed. The records kept by the overseers noted these incidents. The work continued regardless. After the pyramid was complete, the question of what to do with the NEPHILIM remained. They had served their purpose in the construction. The rulers who had organized their use now faced a different challenge, managing a population of large, powerful, difficult-to-control beings who were concentrated near the construction sites. The controlled settlements that had been established to house and feed the NEPHILIM workforce were expensive to maintain. The NEPHILIM themselves were increasingly difficult to keep in the settlement areas now that the work that had structured their daily existence was over. Some of the NEPHILIM dispersed. The control systems that had kept them near the sites weakened after the construction ended. Without the constant demand for their labor and the daily routines that had organized their existence, many of them moved away from the settlements. They returned to the lands outside the construction zone, moving into the more remote areas of the desert and the highlands. Others remained near the sites for a time. They had grown accustomed to the food supply and the presence of large numbers of humans. Some of these were used for other construction projects, smaller structures, walls, other monuments that were being built in the same region during the same period. But the scale of organization that had been used for the pyramid construction was not repeated. The conditions that had made it possible, the concentration of a large NEPHILIM population, the resources of powerful rulers, the specific technical requirements of the pyramid project were not easily recreated. Over time, the NEPHILIM population that had been involved in the construction dispersed and decreased. The tight control that the rulers had maintained over them loosened, and the knowledge of exactly how the construction had been organized, the specific methods used to direct the NEPHILIM, the supply systems, the logistics of the operation, began to fade from the detailed records. What remained were the structures themselves. The pyramid stood in the desert, unchanged by the passing of time. The stones that the Nephilim had carried and placed remained in position. The chambers that the human craftsmen had built inside continued to exist exactly as they had been built. Generations passed. The people who came after the construction, those who had not witnessed it, who had not seen the Nephilim at work, who had no direct connection to the rulers who had organized the project, looked at the pyramid and asked the same question that would be asked again and again across the centuries. How was it built? The answer had not disappeared. It was still there, in the records kept by the overseers, in the accounts passed down by the families of the workers, in the physical evidence of the construction itself. But over time, the direct knowledge became indirect. The specific records were copied, reinterpreted, and eventually lost or altered. The accounts passed down through families became less detailed with each generation. What survived was a general awareness that the construction had involved beings that were not ordinary humans. This awareness was carried in the traditions of the people who lived in the region, in the stories told about the time before and after the flood, and in the descriptions of the Nephilim that were preserved in the oldest written records. But the specific details, the organization of the workforce, the methods used to control the Nephilim, the logistics of the stone transport, the exact sequence of construction, those details became increasingly unclear, and the pyramid remained exactly as it had been placed, stone by stone, over those decades of construction. The blocks still sit with almost no gap between them. The alignment with the cardinal directions is still accurate to a fraction of a degree. The chambers inside are still sealed, still intact, their granite ceiling still holding the weight of millions of tons of stone above them. The Nephilim who moved those stones are gone. The rulers who organized their labor are gone. The human workers who shaped the internal chambers and fitted the outer casing are gone. But the structure they built together, the beings of enormous strength directed by the calculations of human rulers, the raw power of the Nephilim combined with the precision of human craftsmen, that structure is still standing in the desert, visible from far away, exactly as it was intended to be. Nothing that has happened since its completion has been able to explain it away, and nothing ever will.